We've been married for 8 years, and Weston and I have become more and more in sync. He bought a villa for his first love and lied to me, saying he was on a business trip, and I believed him. I had him sign a divorce agreement, lying to him that it was a property transfer agreement, and he believed me too. There's still a 1-month cooling off period before the divorce certificate is officially issued, and I happen to have time to clear out everything related to our 8-year marriage. 1. When Weston came back, I was packing my bags. Before he could ask, I explained directly that my best friend was getting married, and I was going to be her maid of honor in 2 days. Weston breathed a sigh of relief and squatted down to help me pack without a word. Whatever he handed me, I put it aside. My lack of appreciation finally annoyed him. We've said everything on the phone. What else are you dissatisfied with? What could I be dissatisfied with? 1 second he texted me saying he was in a meeting and asked me not to disturb him. And the next second Margaret posted on social media a photo of Weston accompanying her to buy a house. The man looking at Margaret affectionately in the photo was my husband, and the one who replied to my message coldly in the chat box was also my husband. Seeing that I didn't speak, Weston's tone became irritable. Just tell me what you want me to do. I have to go to my parents' place for dinner this afternoon. Don't put on a face like I owe you something. I've been married to Weston for 8 years, and we haven't had any children. Although Weston's parents didn't say anything on the surface, their dissatisfaction with me grew deeper year by year. Every time we had dinner, they would be sarcastic towards me, and Weston would watch me silently. When he saw that I had reached my limit, he would change the subject. I used to think he was taking care of my feelings and helping me out, but now it seems he had calculated that I would endure everything. I got up and went back to the bedroom. I took the property transfer agreement and handed it to Weston. Sign this and it's over. Weston raised an eyebrow after seeing the big words on it, and a hint of contempt flashed in his eyes. Over the years, he had often flown to meet Margaret abroad behind my back. But Margaret always accidentally posted something on social media that she forgot to block me. At first, Weston would always apologize to me and try to calm me down. Later, seeing that I forgave him easily, he stopped apologizing. When he flew back, he would just give me a bag or a set of jewelry to replace the word sorry. The gifts over the years added up to a considerable amount, but compared to this house, it was still much less. After a moment of thought, a sneer appeared at the corner of Weston's lips, and he took the property transfer agreement from me. I was a little nervous, and halfway through reaching for the agreement, his phone rang. He glanced at me and answered the call without any hesitation. I don't know what was said inside, but he suddenly changed his expression and was about to leave. I quickly grabbed his clothes. Sign the agreement before you go. Weston opened his mouth, curled his lips, and the mockery in his eyes was very Tsuyan. He directly turned to the last page, signed his name quickly, and left in big strides. Go to the old house yourself later. After the door closed, I tore off the outermost layer of the agreement, revealing the 4 big words, divorce agreement. If only he had given me a few more seconds of patience when Margaret called, he would have discovered the truth. My hands trembled as I held the divorce agreement. There was still a month left, which was just enough time for me to clean up the past 8 years with him. 2. I wasn't surprised to see Margaret at the old house. Our 2 families have been neighbors for many years and have always had a good relationship. Even Weston's mother never hesitated to express her fondness for Margaret in front of me, always regretting that they couldn't be related by marriage. The day Margaret's family immigrated overseas, our 2 families cried together for a long time. Now that Margaret has returned, everyone is reunited and laughing. Even when I walked into the dining room, no one noticed me. Perhaps the sound of me pulling out a chair was a bit loud. The laughter suddenly stopped, especially Weston's mother, who had an unpleasant look in her eyes, as if she had been interrupted. A trace of guilt flashed in Weston's eyes, and he got up to help me sit down and explained. Margaret said she hasn't eaten home-cooked food for a long time, that's why. Before he could finish, Margaret suddenly stood up, her voice filled with tension. I'm sorry, sister-in-law. It's all my fault for wanting to eat home-cooked food. If you're angry, blame me. Don't blame Weston and Mom. Before I could react, my mother-in-law said lightly. What are you talking about? This is your home. Who would blame you? Weston's hand, which was resting on the back of my hand, tightened slightly. I just found it funny and said calmly, Mom is right, it's just a meal. Yes, it's just a meal. And it's not the first time. The day before Margaret went abroad, she had a party, and I had a high fever at home and was unconscious. Weston, who answered the phone, was drunk, and when I asked him to come back and take me to the hospital, he impatiently said, I'm just out for dinner. Do you have to call me so many times? On our 5th wedding anniversary, he didn't tell me the flight information back until the food was cold and the shop closed. He then connected the video call. Margaret twisted her ankle, and I'm taking care of her here. You don't have to wait for me. It's just a meal. You can eat it later. It's just that I made a big fuss the first 2 times, and he eventually appeased me. Perhaps I should have left at that time. Seeing that I wasn't angry, Weston smiled. I told you Neva is gentle and magnanimous. She won't get angry over such a small matter, Margaret. Don't blame yourself. Surprise flashed in Margaret's eyes, but she still bit her lower lip tightly. Sister-in-law forgives me because you are magnanimous, but I did do something wrong. I'll punish myself 3 cups. She picked up her wine glass and was about to drink it down when Weston stopped her. You're allergic to alcohol. How can you drink like that? Besides, it's not a big deal. What if I deliberately didn't wait for her? Perhaps feeling that his words were a bit too much, Weston turned his head and quietly comforted me. Neva, Margaret is allergic to alcohol. That's why I said that. Don't take it to heart. Of course. What's there to argue about with a soon-to-be ex-husband? Perhaps satisfied with my reaction, Weston continued to comfort me. You love fish. I specially asked Aunt Octavia to cook fish for you today. As soon as he finished speaking, Aunt Octavia brought the fish to the table. Margaret's voice of retching came untimely. Take it away quickly, Weston. I have a bad stomach recently, and I can't smell the fishy smell. Margaret covered her mouth and frowned, looking uncomfortable. A look of shin-tongue flashed in Weston's eyes, and he took the plate from Aunt Octavia beside him. Pour it out, pour it out. Coming back to my senses, I saw my chopsticks hovering in midair. He opened his mouth, and under his gaze, I gently placed the chopsticks on the table. I suddenly remembered something else, so I'll go first. Weston lowered his eyes and grabbed my wrist. Neva, what are you playing at? I brushed his hand away and leaned close to his ear. There are lilies in the living room today. I'm a little allergic, I can't stay any longer. Weston looked at the beautifully wrapped bouquet of lilies, a complex emotion flashing in his eyes, and finally did not say anything to keep me. Those flowers were a gift from Margaret to his mother. His mother loved them very much, and everyone in the family was happy about it. There was no need to upset everyone because of me. I understand all of this. As soon as I got home, I started packing. With Margaret there, Weston wouldn't come back. Speaking of which, I have to thank Margaret. With her around, I have enough time to pack. After all, it took me a full 8 years to fill this house. 3. When Weston came back and saw the mess and the open suitcase, he sighed. Aren't you tired of arguing about the same thing for 8 years? He was referring to my jealousy of Margaret. But I was more curious about how Margaret could bear to let him come back. But I knew the answer the next second. Margaret said you must be angry again, and she insisted that I come back to coax you. Neva, when will you understand that Margaret is just my sister? He knelt in front of me and held me in his arms. You want to eat fish? I'll take you to a fish feast tomorrow. You don't like lilies. I'll tell Margaret not to buy lilies anymore. Don't be angry, okay? Looking at his sincere eyes, I suddenly smiled. Weston, have you forgotten? In the short 2 years from when we met to when Margaret went abroad, I was allergic 3 times because of her. The first time we met, she gave me lilies as a gift. I was about to refuse with a troubled expression, but Weston took them from me and stuffed them into my arms. This is Margaret's heart, take it first and then put it aside. But it was that one time that caused me to break out in a rash and be hospitalized. I still didn't blame anyone at that time. When Margaret found out, she cried like a pear blossom in rain. To comfort her, Weston took her to see the grandest fireworks show, leaving me alone in the hospital. But later I learned from Weston's friends. Margaret had clearly asked what kind of flowers I liked, and the person said anything but lilies. Weston said that Margaret was careless and must have heard it as only lilies. The next 2 times, Margaret had different excuses, and Weston believed them all. This is the 4th time, and there won't be a next time. In the silence, Weston noticed the clothes I was wearing and his eyes lit up. I haven't seen you wear this dress in a long time. I looked down and realized it was my engagement dress, made by my mother. When I was packing, I found that all the clothes were given to me by Weston after our marriage, so I didn't want to take any of them. But I forgot that Weston had personally taken off this cheapao on the night of our engagement and coaxed me to give myself completely to him. Weston's eyes were filled with desire as he stared at mine, and his breathing became heavy. My body stiffened uncontrollably, and I heard my voice cold and pale. Forget it. Margaret just returned to the country and doesn't feel well. You need to go over and accompany her later. Weston frowned and was about to speak when his phone rang. He answered the call with a complex expression and left in a hurry, but he didn't forget to turn back and explain for Margaret. Don't be so petty. Stay home and wait for me. I'll be right back. After the door closed, I collapsed limply on the ground, wiping the skin he had touched with the back of my hand. But it felt like I couldn't wipe it clean no matter how hard I tried. I overestimated my ability to bear it. I thought I could leave calmly. My movements got faster and faster, and I packed up everything. In just over an hour, I looked around and there was almost no change. It turns out that a person's traces can be erased so easily. After leaving the divorce agreement, I left completely. 4. At her best friend Aria's wedding, which was held in her favorite country, France, and also where Margaret had previously settled, I sat by the window, watching everything outside, and couldn't help but think of Weston. What was he thinking when he flew to France countless times over the past 8 years alone? Was it the regret of being away from me for so long, or the excitement of seeing Margaret soon? On the day of the official wedding, when Aria appeared in front of everyone in an exquisite wedding dress, she was so beautiful. I heard again what she had said to me a few days ago. Your Weston has a really good eye. When Weston and I got married, he had the diamond ring and wedding dress custom-made by craftsmen all over France. Although it was not as expensive as a big brand, but the craftsmanship was exquisite and the style was unique. Aria's eyes lit up at that time, saying that she would also go to the same place to order her engagement ring and wedding dress when she got married. At that time, I was blinded by happiness and never thought that when he spent 3 months in France to customize a wedding ring and wedding dress for me, Margaret might have been with him. And how much of Margaret's was mixed in with what Weston claimed was all his own thoughts. I subconsciously touched my middle finger and realized that I had already taken off the ring, leaving it in the house along with the divorce agreement. During the toasting session, Aria held her husband's arm and said she hoped her husband could learn from Weston and be a good husband who loves his wife and family. I shook my head. We're divorced. Aria was surprised. Why? Because. Neva, what are you doing? Weston suddenly appeared behind me, grabbed my arm, and pulled me in front of him. I was surprised that Weston would appear here, but even more surprised by what he said next. Margaret is just my sister. Everyone knows the relationship between us. Do you have to embarrass her in such a situation? What are you trying to do? Margaret lowered her head and pulled on Weston's sleeve. Weston, don't be angry after all. This is someone else's wedding. Weston angrily pulled me away from the wedding banquet and punched the wall behind me. Why are you so scheming now, pretending to be magnanimous and not blaming me, but actually trying to slander me and Margaret in front of everyone? We are husband and wife. Will you be happy to let others laugh at us? I'm a man, I don't care. But what about Margaret? She's a little girl. How will you let her live if you slander her like this? Weston's anger seemed real, but my heart sank little by little. For 3 whole days, he hadn't come home. So, have you been with Margaret all these days, and you haven't been home? And you haven't seen the things I left on the table? Weston was still impatient. Of course I went home, but there was nothing on the table. Apologize to Margaret. I clenched my fists. The things are at home. You can come find me when you find them." Weston frowned and looked at Margaret hesitantly. "Did you see it?" Margaret shrugged with a look that had nothing to do with her. My heart felt even more bitter. The two of them were inseparable. Even when they came to my house, they had to be together. Weston frowned even more, took a deep breath, and said solemnly, "Neva, there is nothing improper between me and Margaret. Secondly, I promised you at the time of our marriage that I would never divorce you in this life." I looked directly at him, smiling. "You promised me more than that. How many of them have you done?" "You." Weston trembled with anger. "You're unreasonable." He turned and left angrily, not forgetting to take Margaret with him. I laughed. "You've already signed the divorce agreement." 5. Arya came over just in time to see Weston leave with Margaret. She was so angry that she wanted to pull him back, but I stopped her. "It's a good day, not a good day for arguing." I hugged Arya and rested my head on her shoulder. Arya finally sighed and hugged me back. "You should have told me earlier. I always thought you were very happy. So your words were really unlucky. I'm sorry, I ruined your wedding." Arya held my hand and pointed to the stars in the sky. "When we were young, you said that many people wanted to be the sun, but you just wanted to be a star. As long as someone is traveling at night, their path will not be dark. Later, you became a journalist because you were unwilling to broadcast some untrue and meaningless things. You were marginalized by the company, but I know that you have also exposed a lot of unfair news. Neva, I've always been proud of you." After the wedding, I returned to my country. During that time, Weston never contacted me. When I got to the company, I found out that something had happened to Margaret's family. It turned out that there was a reason why their family went abroad 8 years ago. Margaret's family was in the construction business. 10 years ago, they contracted the renovation of several primary schools in poor areas. In order to make money, they cut corners, and someone discovered the problem during the inspection. But he bribed everyone up and down, so the final data was not reported. Later, he even used money to manipulate the matter and completely erased his name, so the matter had nothing to do with him. 8 years ago, one of the people who worked with him on the project was arrested for something else, and he was afraid of being implicated, so he hurriedly took his family abroad. Last year, half of a primary school collapsed in a heavy rain, injuring many students. Some people said it was a natural disaster, but there were always righteous people who followed the clues and found Margaret's father. 6. My editor, Bryn, knew about my relationship with Margaret. She sent me the material she had recently compiled. She said it was an opportunity she had fought hard to get for me. 2 weeks later, Weston finally found me. When we met again, he looked much more haggard. I suddenly thought of the quarrel we had before the wedding because of Margaret. I was so angry that I kept crying and said I would definitely call off the wedding. Weston was flustered, apologizing and trying to make up for it. If I didn't see him, he would stay at my door day and night. I looked out through the cat's eye, and he didn't even dare to nap, for fear that I would sneak out. After 3 days, I softened. For the next 3 years, he never contacted Margaret. Those 3 years were also our sweetest 3 years. There was also another time when I accidentally had a car accident. It wasn't serious, I just broke my leg. When he heard the news, he immediately ended the meeting and wanted to fly back. The direct flight tickets were sold out, so he transferred and traveled for more than 10 hours. When he appeared in front of me, he looked even more weak than I, the hospitalized patient. Memories flooded in, and my heart softened instantly, but Weston spoke first. "If you have anything, take it out on me, leave Margaret alone." My eyes turned cold. How could I forget that his haggard appearance had nothing to do with me? "I know you have misunderstandings about Margaret, you hate her, but you can't take revenge on her by writing about her as a heinous person. She already has depression. Do you know that you're almost driving her to death?" I slowly opened my mouth. "So, what do you want me to do?" Shock and disappointment were evident in Weston's eyes, and he eventually looked away. "Stop smearing and slandering her. She's already miserable enough. What will I do if something happens to her?" I lowered my head and said softly, "You found the divorce agreement, right? Let's go get the certificate tomorrow." I don't know how long it took, but I heard Weston say okay. After 10 years of love, I can't count how many times I've heard the word okay from Weston, whether it was doting, fierce, aggrieved, or excited. But this kind of dead silent okay was the first time. Before leaving, he told me that I had been misunderstanding the relationship between him and Margaret all along. Margaret hid the agreement. She always hoped that we could be fine. Neva. Weston's eyes were full of struggle. Why did you lie to me and sign the divorce agreement? When we got married, I told you that I would never divorce you in this life, and I would be with you forever. You promised me that. I looked at him quietly without saying a word. Who said that you have to keep your promises if you regret it? Weston staggered away, but I didn't tell him that I had known for a long time that Margaret had hidden the agreement, and I had heard it from Margaret's mouth. It's just that her explanation was different from Weston's. I never thought of being with Weston. If I really liked him, what would you do? But it feels really good that he already has a wife, but he can still put me first. Actually, if you are willing to endure and wait, you can eventually return to the sweet time you loved each other before. After all, I have to get married eventually. See, even Margaret knew that once you get married, you have to keep a distance. 7. I'm leaving after getting the certificate, I said. Weston stopped me. How did we come to this? I raised my eyes and looked at him with a smile, shaking my head. I didn't want to say anything. I wanted to leave, but Weston wouldn't let me. He stood in front of me, his eyes full of reluctance, as if I were someone he couldn't bear to part with. Thank you for letting go of your prejudice and letting Margaret go. Actually, I don't want to trouble you with her matter. But you know my mom loves Margaret too much. If Margaret is unhappy, she will also follow suit and try to find ways to die. Mom is old. What should I do if something happens to her? Neva, we've been together for 10 years, and even if we get divorced now, we're closer than family. I always hope you can live better than me. If the agreement hadn't been forged by you, I would never have divorced you. What he said was exactly the same as what Margaret said. I looked at him lightly. Are you finished? I have work to do this afternoon. As I turned to leave, I told him, everything related to Margaret was not written by me. It seems that you haven't really understood me all these years. Weston opened his mouth, his eyes filled with confusion. He wanted to say something else, but his phone rang, interrupting him. I took the opportunity to turn and leave. Actually, Bryn was very surprised when she saw me return the materials to her that day. Why? This is a great opportunity for you. I smiled helplessly. I know, but I'm not a saint. I can't stay neutral. I was afraid I couldn't help it and write her to death. 8. After Margaret's father was arrested, the matter of Margaret's family was finally settled. Not long after, news came of Margaret's marriage. When Arya took me to the wedding, I was surprised to find that the groom was not Weston. During the speech, Margaret cried her eyes out, thanking her husband and in-laws for comforting and taking care of her during this time, saying how lucky she was to have met them. But she didn't mention Weston and Weston's mother's help at all. Weston suddenly appeared in front of me with a wine glass. Neva, long time no see. Weston had lost a lot of weight, but when he looked at me, his eyes were burning. I nodded lightly, and then turned my attention back to Arya. But Weston was persistent. He switched places with someone next to me and kept his eyes on me. Neva, now that Margaret is married, you should believe that I really have nothing to do with her. Neva, let's get back together. I really love you, and you're the only one in my heart. Seeing that I was unmoved, he leaned closer. Margaret rushed into this marriage just to make you believe that we are innocent. What else do we have to do for you to believe us? I stared at him in disbelief, unable to believe he could say something so shameless. What do you mean for me? No wonder Weston's mother looked at me so fiercely when I met her by chance just now. It turned out that she thought I had broken up her son's happy marriage. I couldn't help but laugh. Sacrificing your own happiness to complete us, Margaret is quite great. Weston nodded frantically. When Margaret came to our table to toast, her eyes were sparkling. I hope brother and sister-in-law can be as loving and happy as we are forever. I put down my wine glass. We're divorced, isn't it inappropriate for you to say that? Weston quickly pulled me, not letting me speak, but I resisted his touch and wanted to pull my hand back. but he grabbed it too tightly. As we tugged, Arya and Margaret both came over to persuade us. I don't know who touched the table, but I saw it was about to fall down, and I subconsciously protected Arya. When the table fell, it hit my waist. Weston was terrified. First, he checked to see if Margaret was okay, and then he angrily accused me of having everything resolved. Why was I still angry with him? I gasped in pain and just wanted to know if Arya was okay, and if her stomach hurt. 9. After I was sent to the hospital, Arya and her husband kicked Weston out of the ward. Arya was pregnant, and Weston didn't dare to barge in, which gave me some peace. But he would wait for me outside the ward every day, just like he did before we got married. Arya was so annoyed with him, but this was a hospital, and she couldn't drive him away. But she was pregnant, and she had to go for checkups and get a good rest. So she couldn't stay with me 24 hours a day. So Weston always had a chance to come into the ward to take care of me. But this time he was very observant, and he could also put down his pride. As soon as he saw Arya coming, he would immediately hang his head and turn around and leave. Arya wanted to scold him, but couldn't find fault with him. Seeing the ward cleaned up and warm by Weston, with the snacks and fruits I could eat on the table, Arya was worried. "Neva, you won't soften your heart." I raised my head from the computer and smiled, taking a sip of soup. He wants to take care of me, and I need someone to take care of me. Why not? Weston knew Arya hated him, so he didn't hang around in front of Arya. Knowing that I hadn't completely forgiven him, he silently did everything for me. Seeing me yawn, he would draw the curtains and leave and close the door. Seeing me lick my lips, he would hand me a glass of warm water. Seeing me looking out the window board, he would also thoughtfully hand me my favorite snacks and cut fruit. I seemed to see the Weston I had just met 10 years ago. Weston was so attentive when he was chasing me back then. I thought I had found my life partner, and a glance could understand what I meant. I was an orphan, and thanks to the financial support of Arya's parents, I was able to continue my studies smoothly after finishing 9 years of compulsory education. With them, I was able to graduate from university smoothly. Weston knew the significance of Arya's family to me, so he would bring gifts with me to visit them on every holiday. His love for me permeated every aspect of my life, so I didn't doubt when he said he would love me for the rest of my life. When I held his hand and walked into the marriage hall, I was also full of anticipation for the future. In the month I was in the hospital, we got along better and better. I would occasionally allow him to sit next to me and eat with me. Sometimes I would give him the leftover fruit, and he would swallow it in one gulp. We would also sit together and watch variety shows, chase dramas, and play games. Weston laughed happily. I remember when we first got married, we were so happy every day. Margaret called and complained that her husband was too boring, and asked Weston to take her out to play. Weston lowered his voice and said that he was with me and had no time. Weston's mother called to scold him, saying that it was unreasonable for him to be so clingy to his ex-wife after the divorce. Weston coldly interrupted her. My feelings for Neva didn't disappear just because the certificate was gone. If you still can't let go of your prejudice against Neva, we will never bother you again. He said these words to the person on the phone, but his eyes glanced at me, and I saw it clearly. On the day I was discharged from the hospital, Weston was unusually excited. He kept saying that he had cleaned up the house and was waiting for me to go back. Neva, I have a huge surprise for you. You're going to love it. Arya called to give me a ride home, and I said no, Weston was here. I turned to look at Weston, his eyes full of joy. You can take some of the things downstairs first. I still feel a pain in my waist, and I'll need your help later. Weston happily took the things downstairs. When he entered the elevator, I also picked up my bag and left. 10. As soon as I got into Arya's car, the first thing I did was throw away my SIM card. Arya was full of worry. Are you sure you want to go there? It's very dangerous there now, and my parents are very worried about you too. I looked at her slowly bulging belly with love in my eyes. Don't worry, I'll be back before my goddaughter is born. As soon as I finished speaking, Arya's phone rang, and the caller ID showed Weston. Arya curled her lips. You can make him desperate by leaving without saying goodbye. Arya turned off the phone directly and spat fiercely. Serves him right. He doesn't cherish such a good wife. And there will be times when you cry. When I arrived at the airport, Aria's parents were there too. Tears filled the old couple's eyes. They're fighting over there. How can you send such a young girl to report the news? Your company is really something. I explained with a wry smile that I wanted to go. On the 5th day of my hospitalization, Bryn suddenly contacted me, saying that the company wanted to send a few people to the foreign war zone to follow up on some real-time news, and asked if I was willing to go. At that time, Weston was standing outside the ward, looking at me through the small glass, his eyes filled with affection, worry, anxiety, as if the previous things had never happened. I nodded and sent a good message to Bryn. She sighed. I'm both worried that you'll agree and worried that you won't. Remember, safety and health come first no matter what. After the plane landed, my 2 colleagues and I started working busily. Weston somehow found my contact information. When he called, I had just washed the dirt off my face. As soon as he opened his mouth, he choked up, accusing me of lying to him, and not knowing how happy and excited he was that I could go home and see the surprise he had prepared for me. Looking at the people who were displaced by the war outside, I found him ridiculous. Weston, we've been together for 10 years, and I've only lied to you once. What do you have to be angry and upset about? Weston on the other end of the phone was silent for 3 seconds. But I'm really trying my best to make up for it. I've redecorated everything at home to your liking, and I've even bought a cat you like. Thank you for still remembering what I said a few years ago. So come back soon, I'll be good, okay? Weston, when you lied for the first time, you should have understood that you would have to pay a price. Although it came late, it will definitely come. As for whether you can bear it or not, whether you are willing to bear it, it has nothing to do with me. My colleagues called me over for dinner, so I hung up the phone directly and blocked the number. Aria sent me a message saying that Weston had slept with Margaret after drinking and was discovered by Margaret's husband. The two divorced, and now Margaret had nowhere to go and moved into Weston's house. He said they won't really get married. I curled my lips. It would be best if they could get married, so as not to harm others. Later, my colleagues and I returned to China with the written news. Bryn was very satisfied and finally agreed to allocate a portion of the money for me to do my own special topic. Aria gave birth to a child. In the hospital, I met Weston, who accompanied Margaret for a prenatal checkup, but it was said that the two did not get married. When Weston saw me, his eyes lit up with joy. He was about to step forward but was stopped by Margaret, and then the two had a heated argument. Just as the elevator door was about to close, Margaret slapped Weston across the face. That's great. Let them be locked together for the rest of their lives.